why don't we have an open discussion?
Great.
And we'll start with any questions or comments for Bob. Go ahead, kick it off.
I want to come back to John, if that's possible, and
Yes.
make a reference to Bob.
Bye, Eric.
Hi, thank you.
Thanks for that.
Get our seat here.
Thank you.
John, when you started off right at the beginning, you made reference to Jain metaphysics, cosmology, whatever. But then you were worried that, of course, in Christianity you have creation, and the Buddhists don't have creation. It's about getting quickly to liberation and so on. And so it seems as if you wanted to move on then to epistemology. But I thought there was a rather swift move, too swift, in fact. Buddhism does have a very complex cosmology, metaphysics, as you would know, and that whole doctrine of pratitya samutpada, dependent origination, if it is not a theory of creation, it at least is an account and explanation of how things are in the world and how things emerge, if you like, how things are dependent, subvenient relation to it. One of the quotes from Bob on that very aspect of quantum where things are related in the relational holism, I think was the term that was used, where the parts are very much entangled within the whole. I think that sounded very much like Buddhist dependent origination to me. It's the sum of the parts. The whole is always greater than the sum of the parts, but the whole supervenient on the parts themselves. So there is a kind of a causal relation, but the parts do not emerge from the whole. And that's like wetness; they don't actually emerge from the whole. So the relation is a very complex one. And in fact, they're quite happy for you to say, well, it's a paradox, there is a contradiction, and the Buddhists will live with it. Nagarjuna, you mentioned that nothing does arise from the arising, but there is always arising. And the matter is form and form is matter. I mean, there's a lot of very complex. And I wondered why you would have overlooked that. That was the first one. The second one was the dualism, the dualism bit there. Well, we have dualism with Descartes and in Christianity, and so the Buddhists don't have it. But they were challenged by the Hindus on the very dualist, many kinds of dualism, not just a question of one and many, but very specific, definitive forms of dualism, mind and body, soul, in Jain theory, soul and entities and so on. So, they're not just rushing off to get enlightened, from the conventional to the ultimate. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in between as well, if you like, and many riddles too that they might want to go through. There's a whole complex theory of mind. I mean, the epistemology that one might talk about in cognitive science and so on is much aligned with nowadays with Buddhist forms of mindfulness, meditation, and so on. The whole Life Mind Institute that the Dalai Lama is also involved in. In fact, there's a lot of reliance on Buddhist theories of the mind in cognitive science. In fact, some of the questions and challenges that are coming out, and that are rushing off to the laboratories to try and answer these processes. And finally, the third one was the Trinitarian. I was very curious that you took the three traditions as somehow representative or perhaps some kind of analogical thinking that you were able to do through the Trinitarian paradigm. But I would have thought that the three bodies of the Buddha, there's whole discussion, there's a whole big thing about the three bodies of the Buddha. And in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if Frank Clooney, a friend of mine there, although he does a lot more with Hindu Trinitarian rather than the Buddhist Trinitarian, but I would think that he could be persuaded to look at nirvana or the shunya, which is zero, never does amount to 201 in any case. So Judaism for them is not a problem, because non-dualism is ultimately the answer. So it really is not the question of solving the many and the one. It is, but it does not veer towards a one of any kind or three in one. The three can remain interdependent, if you like. The same principle that applies on interdependence here can apply in the transcendental realm as well, without any difficulty. They're not going to rush to try and find a one within that. A non-dual or a non-triadic, I don't know what you would call it, non-dual, not dual, neither not three, which is the last tetralemma of Nagarjuna, would amount to that. So that was the sort of three concerns that I had. I mean, of course, in your dissertation, you probably will be covering this, but just immediately I might share this with you.
John, the floor is yours.
Well, I'll respond to your first because your question was so long, I've lost the thread on number 2 and 3. I'm getting that from Richard Payne, who's the dean of the Institute for Buddhist Studies, and he wrote an article in a book that Ted Peters and Gaiman Bennett published called Bridging Science and Religion, and he was trying to talk about how the Buddhist dialogue with science was going to differ from the Christian dialogue with science, and that you're talking about different things. And one of the points that Richard made was that the Christian mythical approach is dealing with creation, and that throws the emphasis in the Christian dialogue with science to the natural sciences, whereas Buddhism, because its mythical background is the liberation of Shakyamuni Buddha, that throws its dialogue more to the mental sciences because that's what it's concerned about.
But what about the second noble truth, that there is suffering and there is a third, that there is an explanation for the suffering? That is very much a statement about what's going on here. It is not about liberation or rushing to liberation or the nirvana of the Buddha. It is about trying to understand our condition. Our condition is one of anxiety, pain, suffering, and so on and so forth. So let's try and understand. Now that may not be the same as the question that's thrown up by Christianity about creation, but it is about the state of the world. It is about how do things come about? Is there origination? I mean, they do answer the question. So sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah. The other thing, and I mentioned this, that Richard said in that article, was that the Buddhist dialogue with science has been relatively recent. And I think he's talking about Western science. And that Buddhism was not systematically attacked by science. That fight between Christianity and science, that occurred in the West. It didn't occur in the East. And so Christianity has had about a 500-year history of fighting for its survival against this Buddhist worldview. That's the point Richard is making. And so what I was saying was, there's a number of reasons when I got into this, I didn't find the resources that I was looking for.
But you think that the questions that the Hindu schools would ask, on rational logical basis, well, how the hell do you come to this? Here is the reductio of your theory, was not happening. It certainly was happening. It is in the West. It looked, and we gave it the name science, and it came rather late. I mean, the Hindu schools or the Indian schools were very advanced in some of the same questions and so forth. In fact, they provided Aristotle with a whole battery of this sort of thinking that produced later on the questions in science and so on. I mean, if you read the literature, they're doing what you call the encounter of science and Christianity 500 years ago. So it's happening about 1,000 years ago with them. I mean, they have atomistic theories. They have something
order.
almost.
Could we have a short question from the audience?
Yeah, do we have another question to put on the floor for conversation?
Well, I think that was an excellent summary of one critique of your presentation. But that's why I come back to the question of meaning. Because the Oriental thought has a great power of thinking about the question of mind and what is the theory of mind. And that is one reason that it is coming in contact now with neurology, with neuroscience and everything else, because of its centuries and centuries of thinking about the theory of mind. The Western tradition is the question of meaning. And Oriental thought, the idea is, okay, we have suffering, how do we deal with this existential problem that we have as human beings? Is there a solution to it? The solution to it is to really use the mind to try to find mechanisms to change the perceptual state of human beings so that the problems aren't the problems anymore as we thought they were. The Western question is very, very different. The Western question is the question of what is the explanatory power of a system of theology. In other words, that how is it that Christianity has great I would argue great explanatory power as to the nature of creation. Buddhism doesn't basically have an answer to the question of meaning and the purpose of creation. It has an answer, as does Hinduism, to the question of how do we deal with suffering in this existential existence that we all go through. So that's why when we think about these things, we have to come back to the question of meaning and explanatory power. The only one other question I just had was on emergence and wetness. I have a difficulty dealing with what is the operational definition of wetness. Weight, I can understand an operational definition. Wetness, but I could be wrong on this, and that was the second question. Explain to me what is the operational definition of wetness?
Oh, it's just you have a meniscus. There is a property of the surface that is the same as the property of the inside.
And you measure it how?
By a surface tension.
So surface tension is your operational
Yeah.
definition.
Oh, sure. The skin can walk across the surface, not fall in. It's very simple.
You're next.
I just spent a month in Japan. Death in the family, spending a lot of time with the Shingon priest. The esoteric tradition that's very similar to in Japan, that's very similar to the Tibetan traditions, the so-called, what they call it, Vajrayana. Then I spent some time at Khorasan, which is this great mountaintop observatory. Really, the priest coming over to our house loved to explain it. Unfortunately, he explained it in Japanese, but I didn't get all of it. My question is, contrasting two countries, Japan and Korea, both have been nominally Buddhist countries for a very long time, yet Christianity has become has made good purchase in Korea. I think approaching 50% of the population is Christian. In Japan, I think it's less than 5% of the people are Christian. So this is almost a political question, but I think it's related to your topic. From the point of view of these differences between Buddhism and Christianity, as well as similarities, how would you explain this different response of people trained in these Buddhist traditions?
I wouldn't have a clue. If I were trying to find out, I would start talking to people that live there. I don't know what the difference is in the cultural dynamics. I'm just looking at philosophical systems. Interesting question. Wish I knew.
Do you have a hypothesis to answer your own question? We've got Koreans in the room. I don't know if we have Japanese, but
I was hoping that the Koreans would.
I have a personal hypothesis because it's a very interesting question. Having lived in Japan, I think the permeation in Japanese culture of the Zen approach to Hindu Buddhism is very fundamental in Japanese thought. And I don't think it exists in the same extent in Korea. I think that the refinement of that thought, if we can call it thought, and penetration into the culture has made a very, very ethnocentric culture, which it always surprised me how little the Japanese were concerned with our concerns, for example, about meaning and death. Very, very different attitudes towards what we consider the most fundamental existential questions that we can deal with in life. And in Japan, not so much.
Whereas in Korea, Confucianism is a stronger element, and that has very much concern with proper organization of society, maintenance of family structure, a different set of references.
I think there's much more in Korea. There were many more strains of influence on Korea. I think also, I could be wrong about this, but I think the economic level of development in Korea compared to what took place in Japan was later, but that could be incorrect. But I think that the Japanese society is so intensely ethnocentric. It's just the most ethnocentric place I've ever been.
Bob?
I had a question for DK. So DK, I really appreciate your presentation. And I think what I hear you saying is you're combining a kind of divine action notion of the origin of life with a semantic divine action notion. It isn't either or. So you're adding on this notion that God not only creates life with physical consequences in life, you get life, but God also gives meaning to those consequences. Yes. Would that be a fair statement? Oh, yes. Okay. How do you see the meaning expressed in the physical state? I mean, I'm trying to avoid seeing them as very separate, like two different realms. Is the meaning to be found in the actual physical state? Or is it something simply attributed to it? It's sort of the beauty in the eye of the beholder versus beauty in the object of art question. Is the meaning embedded in the physical state that God creates, or is it simply an interpretation of the state we give to it?
When I was developing this semantic divine action, I was having why people, whenever they think about life, they also intends to the idea of the values, like we should respect living beings or something like that. Then that kind of observation leads me to that all the life or living beings or life phenomena itself should have some kind of intrinsic meaning itself. But when I was thinking of semantic divine action, which God endows the meaning onto the emerged living beings, I was particularly thinking of Karl Barth in terms that in his doctrine of creation, even though he was highlighting God's sovereignty over and in creation, but he was also pretty much developing about the threat of nothingness because of creatio ex nihilo. Since all the creation was made out of nothing, it was inherently having the threat of nothingness. So basically, from his doctrine of providence, which is having the precursors, concursors, and subcursors, after the creaturely action, the effect of creaturely action, which we take it for granted, was is to have the divine subcursors. So I was thinking like in the realm of Karl Barth and without momentally and continuous holding of God's the realm of meaning. I'm deviating too much from your question. I'm trusting it anyway.
No, that helps because I was reading you as if the meaning dimension was an interpretation of the physical dimension.
Oh,
see if there's meaning or not, whereas I think you want to say there's intrinsic meaning in what God creates, not just imputed meaning.
So you said formal cause before, actually. So that would be in the object instead of a final cause, which would be in the eye of the beholder.
What would be?
Or it could be in the relation of the object and the creator, which is extrinsic to the object but intrinsic to the reality.
Right. I was arguing from that direction, and I was nervous when I was presenting, but that is why I skipped the important term, that is the space of meaning. So I wouldn't say like, even though I say all the living beings have intrinsic meaning, it does not mean that physical particles have literally the meaning. Rather, I would say there is the space of meaning, and God expands the space of meaning, and by the spontaneous obedience to that space of meaning that is given by God, the living beings are accepting and obeying. Doing so, those living beings become meaningful in the realm of the space of God's meaning.
Thank you.
We'll do one more and then we'll wind down. Go ahead.
I have a question about quantum mechanics, entanglement, and something called decoherence.
Yeah.
Those people who play around with entanglement, and I was one of them, think a lot about how a quantum mechanical state becomes a classical state. And very often that process is called decoherence. Now the problem with decoherence is kind of like when you measure something, and one of the ways people model measurement is by coupling it to a huge system, and that decoheres it. One of the problems with decoherence is that you don't want to decohere God from his relationship with the world. I mean, it's kind of a problem. How would you look at this kind of process of decoherence in the context of entanglement?
That's great. Quick response. I think most physicists would say decoherence doesn't solve the measurement problem. There's still fringes left. Alpha-axis fringes.
Yeah, but it puts it way out into a whole complicated system.
Right. But
It builds
it doesn't really solve the measurement problem. So that's one thing. Decoherence doesn't succeed entirely, but so you don't really explain why you get a classical world and a quantum mechanical world. In the theological context, you could never decohere God and the world, because of God there is a world. It isn't as if there's Ted and me and we relate. So there's God and the world and we relate. To exist is to be in relation to God. Creation means to contend on God for our existence. So you couldn't decohere that relation.
Well, thank you all for coming this evening and engaging in conversation. And I think we have to be out of here by 9 o'clock. Is that right? Otherwise, we have entanglement that we probably don't want. So let's conclude with thanking our three speakers, DK, John, and Bob.